I've had an affair of the heart with this place and with one of its graduates in particular for more than half a century. So before I get down to business, would you permit me one brief moment of sentimental reverie? I shall always remember a Sunday afternoon in early spring, exactly 50 years ago, when I returned from a walk on the back campus over here and climbed into the back seat of a friend's car for the long drive back to Davidson, North Carolina, with the settled conviction that the rest of my life would surely be a happy thing if ever I could persuade that good, bright, beautiful, funny, feisty young woman with whom I just spent the afternoon to spend the rest of her life with me. And happy the rest of that life has been, at least so far. Because her most recent words of admonition ring in my ears this morning: Johnny, you'd better not screw this one up. Now, it's because of that particular alumna, needless to say, that my vantage on Agnes Scott has always been bifocal. Through my own eyes, the distance vision, if you will, as student, as campus pastor, as college professor and administrator, I've always perceived this school to be a truly superb example of the enterprise of liberal learning, distinctive and distinguished among all its peers for what it does and for what it does so well. Well, that's all well and good for one avowed admirer's distant vision, but then there's a second and close-up, not to say myopic, vantage on this through the eyes of Missy Moore Kuykendall, class of '61, through whom this place has been shown to me ever and again, as a humane utopia, an intellectual land of milk and honey, a big rock candy mountain of mind and heart, upon which any other human institution or endeavor of worth needs to be modeled. Not to complain, mind you, but I'd love to have a nickel for every time in my 45 years of working in higher education that I've heard a sentence around the house that begins, "At Agnes Scott, we would have done it this way." And in that, as in most other things, she's usually right. You've already heard that Agnes Scott is not only Missy's beloved alma mater, but that of my paternal grandmother, whom I sadly never knew, Mary Miller Wells, who attended here in 1893-94, not long after the name was changed from Decatur Female Seminary. And also unmentioned is the fact that Missy's mother, Anne Frances Pennington, class of '34, surely the best mother-in-law that anyone could ever have, was also a devoted alumna of this place. In each of those generations and all in between, Agnes Scott has been a place that both attracts and deserves the admiration it receives. So I'm honored to be invited to share this celebration today. As with any other of the serious obligations in life, though, my eagerness at receiving the invitation soon gave way to substantial angst when word came, "We need a title for your Founders Day address." Well, a title, for goodness sake. Somebody who probably didn't have to make speeches once said that finding a title is half of the job. And I have to admit that it took me quite a while. And I'd also concede, if pressed, that the title I've chosen is probably too cute by half. Liberal learning is a dangerous thing. It's a pun, in case you missed it. And we all know that's the lowest form of humor, so you're at perfect liberty to groan. But please grant a temporary reprieve, because in this case, perhaps the ridiculous can be collateral to something that has real meaning for us. A liberal learning is a dangerous thing. That's not a new thought, to be sure. For a very long time, indeed, the notion has been abroad that liberal learning has real potential for danger. Socrates, you all remember, both taught and learned the lesson. Wisest person in Athens, it was said, because he knew that he lacked wisdom, then condemned to death as a corrupter of the youth of the city for the effort to assist that younger generation to discover a similar frame of mind. It's been a fairly consistent refrain in all of human civilization. This sort of education always seems to somebody to pose a certain danger. Quite by happenstance, one of the students in the class I'm teaching this semester turned in a paper last week about attending a very conservative church, where by her telling of it, the minister looked directly at her, a visitor, and made the equation quite forcefully between going to college and going to hell. So by many accounts, early and late, the opinion is abroad that a liberal learning can be a dangerous thing. But I mean to carry the thought in a somewhat different direction today. Talk about the hopeful dangers of this sort of schooling. Founders Day, the Founders Day lecture that I want to give today is premised upon two apparently contradiction observations which inhere in the establishment of Agnes Scott or any institution like this. Here they are. Number one, the founders of Agnes Scott knew exactly what they were doing when they established this place. Number two, the founders of Agnes Scott had no idea of what they were doing when they established this place. Now, first truth, the founders of Agnes Scott, and surely other colleges of its ilk, knew exactly what they were doing in the summer of 1889 when they resolved to undertake the task, quote, of establishing in Decatur a school for young ladies and girls, end quote. Resolved, they unanimously agreed that we determined to establish at once a school of high character. And so they did. They knew what they wanted to do, and they set about the effort with remarkable dispatch. It took them less time to get the school up and running than it might take us in our times to find a date to convene a committee meeting. The founders wanted to set aside a place where young women could be exposed to the influences and ideas which would prepare them for lives of leadership and service. They were persuaded that young women from this community and farther afield both desired and deserved a liberal education, and that the enrichment of their lives by schooling in the context of an institution founded and sustained by the dedication and largesse of the Christian community would not only serve them as individuals, but would serve to enrich the lives of all those around them. Those founders knew what they wanted to do. They believed that faith and learning are both compatible and complementary, and that both are in order to virtue. They believe that the education of women is neither a luxury nor a pastime. It is both essential and necessary. And they believe that the education to be provided must be of superb quality, that in many ways inadequate or superficial education can be more pernicious than no education at all. Quite literally, they must have believed that a little learning can be a dangerous thing. So that's truth number one. Dr. Gaines and the Scotts and the Candlers and the Ansleys and the Kirkpatricks and all the others had a vision. They had an inkling of an opportunity to do something which would accrue to the benefit of their own generation and generations yet unborn. And thus the first truth. But the second is quite contradictory. They knew what they were doing on the one hand, but at the same time, they had no idea of the teleology of what they were about. They had no idea where all of this was eventually going to lead. No criticism intended, please understand, but there's a sense in which those founders who in various ways laid it on the line, finances, energy, influence, advocacy, made the venture with no idea of its ultimate destination. They didn't know, nor can we. Lack of certainty, or better, certainty of contingency, is the very nature of the venture of life, and I'm convinced it's also woven into the fabric of liberal learning. You never know just where it's going to take you. And therein lies the danger of such an undertaking. When I first heard this title pun of mine running around in my head, I began to make a mental list of the things that I believe to be true about the kind of education that goes on in places like this. And my thoughts have coalesced around three dimensions of the experience. One long, two short, in case you're keeping time. Number one, a liberal learning is a dangerous thing, first and mainly because of what it can do to an individual, what it can do to her perception of the world around and her place in that world. It's a dangerous thing because it promises the prospect of shaping a person's life in ways she neither expected nor perhaps wanted. Then number two, a liberal learning is a dangerous thing because of what it may imply about the nature of our life in community together. Certainly in a setting such as this, in the collegium of folks who aspire to modest wisdom, but also in the larger communities of life, for which coexistence and cooperation in places like Agnes Scott College is at least a dress rehearsal, but more likely an absolutely crucial Act 1. And then number 3, liberal learning is a dangerous thing because of the ways it binds you thereby in kinship and obligation to the world in the largest sense, to so many sorts and conditions of people here and now, but also in other places and other times with whom you come to affirm a common humanity. So in each of these arenas, self, community, world, the dangers implied are of a special sort, more venturesome and hopeful, albeit indeterminate, than perilous or destructive. But they're the sorts of dangers that are intrinsic in any worthy challenge, any growth experience, any pilgrimage, any quest in which the destination and the destiny are at once unfathomable but essential to life. So let's spend the rest of these few minutes together reflecting a bit upon the dimensions of these hopeful dangers at places like Agnes Scott. First of all, and primarily, I say again, that liberal learning is a dangerous thing because of what it can do to you as a person. It's dangerous, for example, at a very basic level because, of course, it requires a person to think deeply and critically about what she claims to know and what she can learn, about ideas and opinions she has always presumed to be true, and about other thoughts that had never before been brought to her attention. That kind of thinking implies, no, better, that kind of thinking demands that she will not always think like everybody else, even those who have presumed to be her teachers. And it's dangerous because it obliges her to be analytical, exercising the responsibility of independent judgment. That means she's going to have to learn to think for herself. And that much is basic to the endeavor of the liberal arts. And consequently from that flows the idea that it's also dangerous because when she sees the things that she is about to learn, she needs to move beyond information and technique to questions of meaning and purpose. Remember, I hope, Dylan Thomas's wonderful line in The Child's Christmas in Wales, in which he laments the receipt of, quote, useless presents, quote, like books that told me everything about the wasp except why, end quote. Well, now, liberal learning can be dangerous because it can force a person to ask the question, why? And dangerous because it can then compel her to struggle with the consequences of the answer which the question why might yield. Then, as you run the curriculum at a place like Agnes Scott, liberal learning becomes dangerous because it entices you to explore new areas of interest and endeavor. It entices you to test your wings, quite often with little or no attention to questions which may be quite important to others, such as parents who might want to know how you propose to make a living with this degree or that. You want to learn it because it's there, as Hillary said about Mount Everest, not because it has immediate utility in getting a job or earning $1, and that's dangerous. And then, as we explore those new areas, liberal learning also encourages us to seek connections between and among those new things we have been led to discover. This is what Warren Bryan Martin once called the synoptic function of liberal learning, the quest for the capacity to see life and to see it whole. I recall with a mixture of embarrassment and pleasure the privilege of spending part of an afternoon on this campus in the company of Robert Frost, when I was a hotshot English major, fresh from the dangers and perils of my first encounter with liberal learning at Davidson College. I heard myself that afternoon, it embarrasses me to say, asking the poet laureate of the United States about a connection I saw or thought I saw between one of his poems and a certain novel I had been required to read a few months before. Mr. Frost's first response was a gruff, almost defensive, "I never read it," almost as though I just accused him of a violation of the honor code for plagiarism. But then he kindly continued, "You know, learning is the surprise of seeing relationships between things that you've never seen before." So he gave my ego a reprieve, which some would say is undeserved. But more importantly, he said something quite significant about the mission and purpose of liberal learning. One never knows, of course, precisely where such connections may lead. And another dangerous attribute of liberal learning, which asserts itself in such circumstances, is the settled conviction that we have an obligation to pursue that truth wherever it leads, irrespective of whose ox is gored or whose sacred cow gets slaughtered. And then to pursue the matter a crucial step further, liberal learning can be particularly dangerous because it encourages us to pay careful attention to things not directly accessible to our sensory perceptions, to what we can see and hear and touch and taste and smell, things intangible, but nevertheless altogether real. Liberal learning engages our interest and imagination in times and places not our own, and it encourages us to discover things both similar and different in the life experiences and insights of people half a world or half a millennium away. It invites us to take seriously the phenomena of time and space, the continuities and discontinuities of human history and human culture, and it does so not just in terms of dates, events, people, ideas. It affords us the opportunity to explicate and to understand the symbols and the images of our common humanity. This is our inheritance, and this is our legacy. This is our handprint upon the wall of the cave in Lascaux. This is how we make our mark. These are our memories, and our memories become mentors for our hopes. This is how we know ourselves to be human. But go one step further if you can, because there's one other piece of the danger of a liberal education closely akin. Liberal learning also requires that we pay attention to such intangibles as ideals and values, to allegiances and commitments, even commitments that have to do with faithfulness. And perhaps this is where some of you would like to get off the bus just now, but don't go too rapidly. Liberal learning insists that we take seriously, even if we cannot just now engage, embrace, or appreciate faith. A faith claim that posits a realm of truth rarely, if ever, accessible to the ways we usually know what we claim to know. Indeed, I believe the founders of this place knew that well. Liberal learning can be dangerous because it seems to engage a sympathetic resonance, possible but not certain, between the things you claim to believe and the things you claim to know. And at its best, liberal learning neither blushes nor genuflects in the face of Augustine's dictum, credo ut intelligentsia, I believe in order to understand. That's just a fact of life and learning. But it also entertains the possibility of the obverse, I understand in order to believe. And for me, the real genius of the Reformed tradition which provided the spiritual foundations for this school is the idea that every endeavor of our learning is conducted under what Roland Fry once called a negotium cum Deo. I'll go easy on the Latin after this. A dealing with God on a very direct and immediate basis. And the danger, again, the hopeful danger, I would insist, of that sort of learning would be the obligation to pursue truth wherever it leads for God's sake. And that might just include the articulation of a faith you can live by. Liberal learning is a dangerous thing. Now, one other hopeful thing about the dangers of liberal learning for each of us as individuals. Liberal learning can be a dangerous thing because it insists that each of us find a way to take ourselves quite seriously, but not too seriously. In matters of personal introspection and self-concept, this is the sort of education which warns against both hubris and acedia, that's Greek, not Latin, against both pride and self-hatred, against thinking too much of yourself or thinking too little of who you are or can become. And please understand that this attribute of liberal learning is neither a warning against proper assertiveness on the one hand, nor encouragement to become a wimp or a dweeb on the other. Really nice cartoon I saw a few weeks back shows St. Peter greeting a new arrival at the check-in desk. Computer screen right there providing this person's transcript. You say meek, says St. Peter, but your records say passive-aggressive. Now, none of that sort of contrived self-negation. Liberal learning encourages that sort of Socratic modesty which insists that there's always something else to be done to approach true wisdom, but it also engenders a certain confidence that we have begun to learn and that we will continue to do so. And by the way, the label we put on that ceremony at the end of every 4 years of a student's time here is every bit as good as its word. It is commencement. It is the beginning and not the end of the pilgrimage of a liberal learner. And for all the rest of the life that follows, be it short or long, liberal learning is dangerous because it insists that each of us do something with what we've been given. And it also seems to imply that making a living is not nearly so important as making a life. And lives are authenticated more by our curiosity about and our engagement in the world around us than they are by our manipulation or our domination of it. And while that life we make bids fair to include such things as a job, home folks surely hope, or a career, or a profession, or a field of endeavor, some or all of those engaging life occupations should surely be trumped, ultimately, God willing, by a vocation, by a calling, by the intersection of one person's gifts and commitments and joys with those things, small or great, that the world around us urgently needs. And when all is said and done, vocation may be the greatest danger that a liberal learning affords. For some few who are products of liberal learning, vocation may seem to be an obvious certainty all along, as I've confessed concerning my conviction 50 years ago after that afternoon walk over toward the observatory. For most of the rest of us, though, it comes either as an infrequent vision or perhaps a retrospective glance insofar as vocation is concerned. We look back and say, hey, that's really what I was supposed to be doing. But however they come, such callings are attended by the dangerous premonition that much is required from those to whom much has been given, so that we can never quite dispel the notion that we are meant to be of use and to make a difference. Well, point 2, if you like visual aids. In such a place at Agnes Scott, a person can begin to learn about herself, and then she can also begin to learn about how that self fits into community. Once again, liberal learning here can be a dangerous thing because it provides a context for us to learn about life together, not as though it were a solitary adventure or an end in itself for each one of us. We learn life in communities like this one through the help and society of others, not as though we can fabricate a utopia or an Eden which is eternal, but as though for some brief time together we can assemble a sort of laboratory for life and living which will allow us to test the values and ideals, the hopes and the dreams, the capabilities and the insights which we carry forward. Now that's a dangerous thing for one, because it exposes a person for one brief shining hour that may last as much as 4 years more or less to the sort of Camelot of mind and heart which will always after coalesce as a fond memory and a cherished hope of what life together in community ought to be about. It's at Agnes Scott we would have done it this way. Here you encounter people, students, teachers, staff, who are willing to claim together the responsibilities and the prospects of humane society and common values. And here you also encounter the sort of mandate to servanthood transferable into all the other communities of life that proceeds from what Ernie Boyer once called an educated heart. Your conscience is quickened in this sort of place, and it won't easily be sedated in other times and other places. In a Founders Day address here a few years back, former Dean C. Benton Klein told a delightful story about a student who once said to him, "Do anything you want to enlighten my mind, but leave my morals alone." And Dean Klein said, as surely he should have, it can't be done and it shouldn't be done. This place is by its very nature a crucible of character, and that could be dangerous. A student who comes to a place like Agnes Scott may never again live in any place where the sharing of humane instincts and ideals is quite so intimate or instinctive as will be the case in these 4 years so quickly sped. But as with all the personal dangers of liberal learning, this danger of life in community is laden with promise, because such an experience inevitably haunts the mind and heart, so that ever after the product of liberal learning is obligated to aspire to express the ideals and insights of this place in every other community of which she may be a part. And that even holds true for the most extensive and expansive arenas of that future life of hers. Because, number 3, if you will, the hopeful danger in community life thereby accrues to similar dangers in the life of this world. Liberal learning demands continuing attention to the world in which we live. It demands commitment, concern, investment of energy and talent directed to the common good, lest we default upon what we have learned about ourselves and our own humanity. Just a few weeks ago, in preparing for the course I've been teaching this term, I came across an autobiographical essay entitled Wild Geese to the Past by Constance Curry, Agnes Scott class, 1955. People in this community have met her in the last several weeks. But for those who don't know the story, let me repeat it in brief. Connie Curry came to Agnes Scott in 1951 from circumstances probably not all that different from those of young women and men of my generation all over the South. Racial segregation and equality were de facto the law of the land, and in all likelihood, many or most of the people she encountered here at Agnes Scott were compliant, if not comfortable, with the way things were. Surely no one would have supposed that by coming to Agnes Scott she was thereby nestling herself into a hotbed of radicalism. And personally, I'm sure that's not the way it was in any case. But surely she might have discovered, indeed I'd reckon that she certainly did discover, that Agnes Scott College intended for her to embrace the dangerous luxury of thinking for herself. And further, that the things that she learned here were not merely book learning for her mind's delectation. They were lessons for how she could and should aspire to live her life, and quite obviously so she did. Connie Curry went from Agnes Scott to participate actively in the greatest effort to bring about social justice in this country that my generation, maybe most generations, could ever experience. For years she worked tirelessly with the National Student Association and as a rare non-African American in the intentionally and understandably black Student Nonviolence Coordinating Committee, SNCC, in the efforts of both organizations to bring about equal rights and justice under the law for black Americans. If memory serves, that was at a time when nice people like Scotties did not often do such things, and it was probably downright dangerous in many circumstances in a literal sense and not in the metaphorical way that I've been playing with the word just lately. But Connie Curry did it. Writing of her in later years, Julian Bond stated that, quote, Connie was a bridge between the overwhelming number of black sit-in students and white students who were predisposed to join with us, end quote. And she moved from those responsibilities to a long tenure as the Southern Field Representative for the American Friends Service Committee, in which capacity she worked tirelessly to implement the rights guaranteed in the civil rights legislation she'd helped to obtain. Now, this story is important. It's important because Connie Curry worked with a wonderful mixture of commitment and compassion, because she undoubtedly realized things about herself and the broad dimensions and definition of community as a student at Agnes Scott College. And the story we tell about her is literally one of myriad stories that could be told. Stories of Agnes Scott women who have made a difference, in ways that the founders could never have imagined, might not have altogether liked, but of which they would have certainly been proud. People who risk the dangers of liberal learning have the privilege of making a difference in this world. Women who go to Agnes Scott College have the opportunity to move even beyond Dylan Thomas's question about why of things like wasps or wars or ways of life to the why not question. Why not change things? Why not make this world a better place for us all? And that's the ultimate danger of liberal learning. Now, let me go back to where I began for just one moment, and then I'm done. I have been both intrigued and delighted over these recent months on the several occasions to hear my friend Elizabeth refer to Agnes Scott women as feisty. As an Agnes Scott spouse, first thing I'm tempted to say is, tell me about that. But I forbear. I forbear because we all should never entertain the idea that such feistiness is a synonym for irascibility or that much overused B word, bitchiness. I am convinced that this particular sort of feistiness of which Elizabeth speaks and which you women embody is the sort of feistiness which is the amalgam of character and conscience and competence and commitment. And I'm also absolutely convinced that that sort of feistiness is the habit of the heart which derives from the dangers of liberal learning that this school and surely others in its mold intend for students who pass this way. This is the sort of education that compels you to think critically and to think for yourself. This is the sort of education that compels you to go beyond questions of information and technique to questions of meaning and purpose. This is the sort of education that compels you to seek new areas of learning and to try to discover the connections between and among everything that you learn, to pursue truth wherever it leads, and to refuse to be satisfied with a reality which is limited by your sensory perceptions. This is the sort of learning that compels you to be open to the matters of the Spirit and to learn the modesty of wisdom, to hold out for a calling which is larger than your ego, and to look for the ways in the community and in the world in which your learning can make a difference. It's a sort of education which is indeterminate and unpredictable and therefore dangerous, but it may be the only sort of education that makes sense of all the other sorts. Thank you very much.